Right. Well, I think we're now live. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. And so today's webinar is developing a transparent approach to carbon-aware design, delivery, and reporting with one of our customers at One Click LCA, Bennetts Associates, a leading architecture firm in the UK. So we're excited to be joined by Harry and Ben from Bennetts to take us through work that they're doing in order to achieve their sustainability goals. After the presentation, we'll have a live Q&A, so feel free to drop any questions that you have into the chat as we go along, and so our Q&A panel can answer these at the very end, and so we'll try and do as many of those as we possibly can. So for those of you who aren't familiar with One Click LCA, we're a global end-to-end sustainability platform for construction products and projects with a mission to power the makers of a zero carbon future. So the software allows you to gain accreditation for over 80 different standards. We've got the largest material database in the world of about 250,000 data points, over 20 different integrations, and it's used all over the world. So you can learn a bit more about who we are, the work we do, and who we work with at oneclicklca.com. So my name's Samuel Boswell. I'm a business developer at One Click LCA, and I'll be your host for today. And I will now leave it to you, Ben and Harry, to introduce yourselves, to let the audience know who you are, a bit about the work that you're doing at Bennetts, and Ben, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so my name is Ben Hopkins. I'm a senior associate and the overall sustainability lead at Bennetts Associates. I'm, as well as sort of organizational sustainability and footprinting, my focus has historically been on embodied carbon, and I've been involved in sort of LETI, UKGBC, and more recently the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. I'll pass over to Harry.
Morning everybody. So my name's Harry Sumner. I'm a sustainable design lead at Bennetts, which I'm focused primarily on projects. So I guess that sort of transpires as a lot of focus on upfront carbon, which we'll sort of be running through today, but also the kind of wider aspects of sustainability. Alongside that, I also, sort of similar to Ben, some of the recent stuff we've been doing, well, obviously project work, but also things to do with Net Zero Carbon Building Standard.
Brilliant. So thank you, guys. And I'll now just go straight ahead and I'll pass it over to our guests to take you through the process they are following to understand and reduce the embodied carbon of their work. So take it away, guys.
Great. This is a bit of a mouthful that I'm not going to read out, but the presentation is essentially about sort of tackling the emissions on projects, reducing them, and then reporting and measuring them in a sort of efficient and quick way. For those of you that don't know Bennetts Associates, since we were founded in sort of 1987, we've historically been known as, it says pioneers in sustainable design and business there. I think at the very least we've been mainstreaming it sort of in large projects. And that's historically been through sort of low energy buildings kind of in the 90s, then moving through into materials, founding the UK Green Building Council, or co-founding, and then doing a lot of work on organizational reporting for sort of the last decade, quite a lot of work on embodied carbon for the last maybe 10 years or so, and then more recently things like Neighbours, Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, and we were certified as a B Corp about 3 years ago. In terms of our history with upfront carbon assessments or whole life carbon assessments, I think one of our projects in the 2000s was Wessex Water, and that was one of the first LCAs that was sort of done as part of an early BREEAM. And that was kind of where we first learned about LCA, and since then we've kind of been developing our experience, and I think that really kicked off kind of in sort of 2010s onwards when we were doing work for Argent, the Camden Council headquarters, the Meta HQ, and then the sports hall, where we were given specific targets, and we worked with Sturgis carbon profiling from stage 2 right through to completion, sort of reducing and measuring and reporting. And we sort of took over some of that at the very end, and that was the first LETI public declarations that we were a part of. Then sort of around 2021, 22, we started doing our own internal calculations. That was initially with our own tool, but eventually when we started getting paid to do it, we moved over to one-click just for efficiency and sort of standardization reasons. And as we sit here now, we're probably doing about half of the reporting for projects that are coming into the office, and we're reporting our full portfolio in alignment with UK GBC, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So, I mean, obviously preaching to the converted on this call, but why we care is we've been measuring our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for quite a long time, but they're completely dwarfed by the project emissions. And this is just completed projects for 1 year. When you start to work out the responsibilities, it probably ends up about equal, but we do feel like we need to sort of be transparent and responsible for the project emissions that we're responsible for. And so so far I keep saying upfront carbon, that is on purpose. We do report whole life carbon where required, but our focus as architects tends to be on, as well as energy usage, the upfront carbon, because that's just where we have the most impact. It's the more urgent issue, and to be honest, the numbers are slightly more reliable in terms of the assumptions that you're making. And so the presentation today, which Harry's going to do the majority of the talking, is really about looking at our workflow that we've developed to try and sort of tackle these challenges that we see, which is that we want to reduce project emissions. We want to sort of report in a sort of transparent and accurate way. But we don't have masses of resource. You know, the sustainability team that we have is essentially Harry's full-time. I'm sort of in between things, and also the project teams don't have masses of time to sort of dip into sort of calculations and other things. So that's the challenge that we find ourselves with, and the process that we've developed for that is kind of the idea of using kind of quick wins, low friction things, so benchmarks, standard assemblies, and then sort of moving into the detailed assessment with a smaller team that can use those things to sort of make things more efficient, and then transparent reporting at the end to try and make sure that we keep ourselves honest. So the presentation breaks down, and Harry will talk about the first two things, is that idea of the sort of the design aspects and sort of creating that low friction environment for the design teams, then how that works in terms of delivering fast, accurate, but transparent reporting, and then ending on how we're reporting sort of our full portfolio and how that incentivizes us to do calculations on all projects. So I'll hand over to Harry.
Cool, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so as Ben said, we'll try and give a sort of fairly detailed of the process that we have kind of developed to do this efficiently at the different stages of a project. And one of the kind of most powerful tools we think we have at early stage is benchmarking. I think really people probably think about benchmarking only in terms of sort of the building level, which is obviously sort of important, and that's one thing that we do. But I think really what we take it as is an opportunity to sort of capture and record as much information from our project portfolio, so all of our live projects where possible, and keep that in a kind of granular form as possible to help inform sort of parallel or future projects. Because really this kind of data, be it sort of upfront carbon or operational energy, it has an inherent value to us as architects, and so sort of monitoring, tracking and recording that is really useful. So the kind of approach you take on a whole building level is we basically database it. We have this kind of live database of all our projects, which I'm sure most practices will have in terms of their sort of general project management and QMS processes. But what we do is we just plug in upfront carbon at pretty much every stage we can. So hopefully every project has it from stage 3 onwards. If not, we do the assessments ourselves if external consultants haven't. And we try and keep that data in a sort of almost the rawest form that we're giving it. So if a consultant gives it in kind of a certain breakdown that we can't then sort of disseminate further or disaggregate further, then we keep it as that. But generally we like to split it down into all of the building categories if possible. The reason being is then we can sort of answer questions quickly in future, or use these kind of these breakdowns as a benchmarking tool. So it's not just about that sort of single number for our past projects, but it's about the individual building elements, which means that then we can go to a kind of more granular level of benchmarking for new projects. So very early stages, if we've just been appointed, or the design team sort of just getting started, we can begin to look at things like defining element budgets, or understanding. Quite often structure is one of the first things that we'll be looking at with the structural team and doing optioneering. So having those benchmarks at kind of building element level is really useful to sort of sense check, but also even to do very early stage kind of assessments of a project, which we often have to do, or sometimes we sense check external consultants' work as well. So having that sort of basis from our sort of portfolio of previous projects that is kind of robust and accurate data, we can then quickly make informed decisions sort of moving forward on new projects. Then I guess that inherently sort of leads to an even more granular level of kind of benchmarking or assembly level assessment. So perhaps at this point it's moving away from previous project sort of full assessments, but actually now looking at kind of local studies of certain elements that we do separately, but we still record these in the same way, so that we kind of maintain this knowledge within the practice. So this is really useful for things like facades, stairs, obviously, even finishes, internal walls, floors, ceilings, all of these things that are repeatable elements and sort of specifications that we use across a wide range, virtually every project that we are involved with, whether it's sort of retrofit now or new build. So I think the sort of power of benchmarking is really about that kind of quick answers to sort of difficult questions, but also using data that we know is robust and we have put the effort in up front, basically. I think that the idea of benchmarking at that kind of element level and how that interacts with one-click really is about private constructions. So if you're not familiar with what private constructions are, they're basically sort of little assemblies that are within the general one-click database, or they appear within them, but they're assemblies that you yourselves as a kind of organization have created. This is something that we've really tried to sort of maximize in terms of our approach, because we think these are really useful. So yeah, they appear there in the kind of general database, but they're only visible to us and our users. And what they are essentially is a way to document those kind of small element level studies. So for example, here we've got a kind of internal wall build-up that is a specific standardized element that we use across a whole range of projects. And what this sort of private construction allows us to do is to capture or sort of pre-decide or predetermine the EPDs, the assumptions that are going into this, the quantities, all of the kind of LCA variables for this wall build-up based on a single functional unit. So in this case, it's the square meter of wall. So then when we come to say answering a question or doing a quick assessment, or even in a detailed assessment using this specific kind of element that the design team might be specifying in the real building, we just then need to put in the functional unit quantity, so a square meterage of wall. Again, we know that the data in there, we've kind of done the QA process, we've done the sort of hard work up front to make sure that we know the quantities are right, the sort of assumptions are correct. So then it means in future, the process is really quick. And what that kind of naturally leads us to is we're sort of maximizing this by creating a practice library, essentially. So this is a library of a whole range of kind of subcategories, which we are going to be specifying regularly on projects, and it just makes sense to try and standardize these, understand the sort of carbon impact, but also have these in a kind of BIM environment and really understand the detail of them. So whilst we're sort of looking at using these kind of private constructions and assemblies, we still want to maintain a level of transparency with them. It's quite easy, potentially, if you've got them in a kind of an LCA format, if they're your own constructions that people can't necessarily understand just by the sort of naming of them. It's really important that we sort of show the assumptions and the kind of detail behind them. So we try to report this in a really clear and sort of transparent format for the clients and for the design team as well, so that they can see what the kind of data we're using is. And I think that basically these form a kind of part of almost like a cycle within the practice of efficiency, really. So it's not just about LCA, it's about how we approach design in general, particularly in the kind of BIM environment. So it starts with standard assembly, standard details that really are driven by us and our technical team. So these are things that are kind of rigorous and sort of checked by the technical team, and we understand that they work as a starting point, and they're the kinds of things that we are going to be specifying. And then these are the same assemblies that then the design team will be seeing in the BIM world. So when they're starting a project, if the assemblies are there and they're using them, then it makes this whole process easier, because then we link the one-click sort of private constructions to this, and so we get this kind of synergy between the different aspects. So the idea being that the design team starts to, it's efficient for us, so it's efficient when we're doing sort of assessments, but also it means that the design team start to come into contact with kind of the environmental aspect of what they're specifying across a whole range of sort of touch points almost. The latter, the sort of last one being the physical library, which we'll touch on in a second. But really, like I say, the aim is that we're almost embedding this kind of data naturally into processes that we're already doing as a kind of design team, and just making it easier to have these kind of quick, informed decisions embedded within the sort of existing process. So as I said, I guess in an architectural setting, a physical library still wins in terms of materiality. It's really difficult, and it will probably never be replaced by an entirely digital process. And we enjoy having the kind of a physical library within our practice, within our studios, but finding ways to sort of combine the physical library with the sort of digital stuff we're talking about with one-click, and with just general kind of the BIM environment and all this stuff is quite challenging. So something that we have been working on recently is finding ways to try and sort of bridge this gap. One of which we've kind of done a curated sort of low carbon materials library, where we've our sustainability team sort of pre-assess a lot of the kind of materials that we're using, and aggregate the kind of data about it, and then put this into a sort of digital database, which we can then link with a QR code, so that people can be a design team, sort of consultants, clients, whatever, when we're in that kind of in-person setting, can still have that physical kind of materiality and the benefits of a physical material library, but also we're bringing that data element into it still. So we still get the link to LCA, to other aspects in there as well about sort of circularity, cost, sort of practical things, but again, bringing that data to the forefront, so it's easy to make informed decisions throughout the process. And I guess one way we're now trying to streamline that even further is by creating our own sort of digital library that really makes this process even easier for the design team to kind of select low impact materials, really. So one of the benefits of this, I guess, it's essentially collating all the data I just showed you that we would have in our kind of link to our physical library, but then it allows also specific things about, for example, transport for a project, and really understanding the distance from suppliers, or the availability of products, or again, the cost. So I think the message from our kind of early design stage process is really about trying to bring data, LCA and sort of environmental impacts away from the formal LCA process that we're all probably familiar with, and bring it into a format that is embedded and sort of, I guess, almost surreptitiously embedded within the kind of existing design practice, so that it's kind of less obvious. There's less kind of friction point. It's just happening naturally. Those decisions are easier to be made because the data is already there in the BIM library, in the physical library, etc. So that's kind of the process that we take in terms of, I guess, our early design process and specification and all those kind of things. But then there's a whole nother side to it, which is how we deliver this on projects sort of formally, be that sort of paid work or just doing our own LCA, because regardless of whether we kind of, there's a consultant appointed or not, we still want to have that upfront carbon data for our own portfolio and for our reporting that Ben will touch on later. So we take a kind of slightly different approach with this. I'll give a kind of project example for this because it's probably easier to run through in that way. So this is the project that will sort of, I guess, use as the guiding point for the delivery stage. So it's a project in Manchester, which is a kind of retrofit and on-fill structure. So it's got a mass timber extension above, so 3 stories on top and 6 existing stories. And it's currently going into stage 5 now. So we're doing the full carbon assessment. We joined at stage 2, and we're going to be taking it through to sort of verification and practical completion. So the sort of process I'll demonstrate now is generally what we would do at a kind of stage 3 or stage 4, but the kind of works also apply in the same principle really through to practical completion, and eventually we'll be looking at the sort of detailed assessment for reporting against the net zero carbon building standard, hopefully. So I think touching back on the sort of design process that we mentioned, benchmarks come into the project as the very first start point, really. Using that data that we've kind of aggregated and broken down in a way that we can sort of understand the building element level means that we can then, on new projects like this, understand or take a budget or target from the client, in this case, which was the 350 kilograms CO2 per meter squared, which is so based off the LETI rating, A rating, if you're kind of familiar with them. We can then start to break that down almost as a kind of first step, based on some very quick studies about, you know, the amount of structure. With the structural engineer, we can work out roughly what the proportion of that is, and then we can start to look at different benchmarks for certain elements to help spread this into a kind of framework for the consultants to work with and moving forward. That's something which can be kind of measured against. Obviously, they're not set budgets, it's more of a guide, but we can then, as we sort of move through the stages, be referring back to it and have a kind of more granular level of understanding of where things might be sort of where things might need more focus, I guess, in terms of carbon reductions, rather than just seeing kind of a full, you know, total of either on budget or over budget. Then I think really in terms of our approach to sort of detailed studies or sort of full LCA on building projects is about taking advantage of the sort of embedded functionalities within OneClick, but in a way that we also works with how we work. So I think one thing that probably should preface it is that we like to control and understand all of the assumptions and understand the process in quite a lot of detail. I guess that sort of Ben alluded to it, that previously we used Bennetts used their own tool that was kind of created by Ben and others. So I think understanding that process in detail really helps us to sort of take ownership over it. So what we sort of take advantage of in terms of OneClick is certain functionalities that it has with with Excel primarily. So we don't use the Revit imports and sort of streamlining that process, but we use the Excel ones. So our process generally would be about collating quantities first, obviously, as you kind of anyone would have to do, but look into cost plans, look into consultant information, all that kind of stuff, and creating our own inventory. That's in our environment, so that's in a template that we've created that we use to track our projects. That then we can either upload manually or using the Excel functionalities. So I'll kind of go into this in a bit more detail in a minute. Obviously the bulk of the calculation is done in one click, the data is done in one click, but then we bring it back out of one click to do our QA, to do our reporting, all of that kind of stuff. So this is our sort of material inventory. This is our kind of Bennetts template that we use. So this would be the first step of kind of filling this out based on cost plan, based on the various information that we have, and recording all the relevant information sort of line by line. The really important bit that we sort of take advantage of when using these kind of Excel uploads and downloads from one click is the comments function. So we have this sort of unique tracking ID on the left hand side. You can't really see it probably, but it basically is each element, each line item has a unique kind of numeric reference. We then embed that in the comments section in one click, so that essentially we can now track through, as we move forward through the rest of the stage or the rest of the project, we can track each individual line item. And that's really helpful when we get to things like QA and actually creating reports later. So depending on the sort of scale of the LCA and basically the number of line items, we'll either input it manually or use the import from Excel function, which you might be familiar with. And then that brings it in. So now we've got it in the one-click environment. We've sort of got materials assigned. We've got all of our quantities. We've essentially got our LCA inventory in one click. And you'll see that in the comments function, we've got those unique sort of numerical reference tracking through now, which link each line item back to our own sort of database where we'll be doing some of the sort of later process. So one click does its thing, does the sort of detailed assessment, and then we use the download Excel. That's the format that we take the first step, which is for QA. So this downloads essentially the screen that you're seeing. So it downloads all of the assumptions, really. That's the main thing, quantities and assumptions for the LCA, which is something that we want to check before we sort of proceed. And so we bring that back into our we bring that Excel format back into our template, and that allows us then to look at each line item. It tells us what the assumptions we've put into it are, and then one of us can then do the QA process. So to make sure that we're doing a rigorous assessment, and this is going to be ever more sort of increasingly more important with the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, because it's you have to be third-party verified at the end. So making sure that we do this process kind of rigorously from the start is really important. We follow a sort of UK GBC outline guidance on this. There's not lots of guidance on doing it sort of on the QA process as such, but there is some out there, and this is really useful that one click can kind of draw down all your assumptions, and you can check them before you kind of proceed. So then we'd obviously make any changes as needed in one click if there's sort of errors, and then we use the one click results report download function. So that brings, again, an Excel format, but now the results in a really kind of granular level of detail. And I haven't shown the screen that we put it into, but we essentially copy paste it into one of the tabs. And that essentially then, with the comments reference linked in still, we can kind of draw through results line by line. And this gives us a really, basically the maximum flexibility for sort of manipulating the data for how we want to report it back to the client and the design team. So it means we can do things like this, where we're sort of giving things like responsibility to specific savings or specific uplifts based on each line item. So we can say, in this case, ourselves got the most in terms of savings, which is nice. But also things like in terms of the RICS version 2, you can do the new build and the new area and existing area splits, which you have to do, things like that. So it just gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of breaking down that results data. Oh yeah, so yeah, that's the kind of reporting approach, which in this particular project, given that there is sort of a new area on top, existing area below, we have to do that sort of formal reporting process for RICS, and so this is really useful for that. And then the last thing really in terms of how we approach a kind of detailed studies on projects is, particularly at stage 3 and stage 4, is going the next step beyond results and looking at savings and potential carbon sort of VEs. Again, this sort of granular level of data, having your data broken down into almost line items or the full RICS category, helps to then assign potential savings, but also that's kind of at a project level, but also you can bring back in the benchmarks that we talked about right at the beginning into this, because if we know that certain systems are being used, for example, facade systems, if we're trying to compare with sort of potential VE options, and we understand benchmarks, valid, kind of robust benchmarks that we've calculated previously, we can very easily give an indication of what the potential savings are at this stage without having to go into sort of a serious level of almost recalculating everything. That being said, in terms of the one-click functionalities that we can take advantage of here, the other one that we look at is to use the design function to sort of duplicate and do a kind of optioneering process, depending on sort of what it is that we're looking at. So that's kind of a run through of our approach in terms of sort of early stage and then detailed design. I'll pass back to Ben.
Thanks. Yeah, so I guess this is appearing at the end of the presentation, but it's almost a cyclical thing, and that this is almost what's driving a lot of the reasons why we're doing more calculations on projects, unless we're being paid to do it. So as I said, we sort of see ourselves as having to take some responsibility for projects, and therefore when we're reporting our emissions, we want to do that. Similarly, for those that aren't aware of, we've got something called the Tell the Truth campaign, which is about trying to improve transparency and verification within sort of the sustainability claims sort of realm. And so internally, what that means is if we say something in the press, in a press release or in a planning application, if it's related to sustainability or particularly carbon, then it has to be backed up with data. So it has to have a link back to some data or explain itself so that someone could check it. And that's driving a lot of the take up of sort of measuring projects, especially older projects that are coming through now. And we want to say nice things about them because they're good projects, but we kind of need to back it up with data. As we said at the beginning, Harry and I and a few other people in the practice have been heavily involved in the new net zero carbon building standard, and that's going to drive even more transparency, particularly around upfront carbon, which needs to sit within that specific limit. And then the UKGBC's latest guidance on reporting against Scope 3, so projects as the Scope 3 within an architect's portfolio. We've sort of been involved in that, and I think our latest reporting is seen as kind of the first example of that in the wild, really. So what it actually looks like, very simply, is this. It's a list of all of our projects with the upfront carbon associated. And apologies if you can hear drilling in the background. It's sort of perfect timing for a webinar. So rather than just reporting the completed projects, which is what we've done for a few years, what we took the view was that doesn't really show you how we're doing as a practice. What it tells you is, if you're just doing one number, it tells you how much area you've completed mostly. But it also only tells you how good you were sort of maybe 7 or 8 years ago at designing buildings. So we now report everything that's completed stage 3. Obviously, the earlier in the stages it is, the more uncertainty there is with version 2 assessments. There's got the uncertainty on top of that. all of our projects are captured in that. That doesn't mean that they all have data, but we're very clear that we are showing all projects so that people can understand kind of how a single project sits within our portfolio. If most clients are kind of happy with that, if they're not, if it's not a public project, we just anonymize it, and that seems to be okay. And in terms of if you actually go into the report, it's available on our website, the B Corp report. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. Each name that has any data associated with it, you can click on that. You can get a download on the right, which is essentially a sort of an updated version of the Letty Declaration, and that gives you hopefully enough information that you can look at it and you can be like, well, it's a low number, but they haven't counted MEP, and there's nothing more annoying than not really understanding why a building's sort of super low. And so, it's about keeping ourselves honest. And as we move forward with the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, that's obviously going to end up being an even bigger document. As I said, we try to highlight as much as possible so that people don't get confused. So we try to show the scopes. So like if it's a full new build, you'll see that it's a bigger number. If it's a retrofit or a fit out, then it's going to be a smaller number. And we're trying to make that as visible as we can so that we're not sort of claiming super low numbers and people are thinking that we're managing to get those with new builds. And then obviously the biggest thing is the numbers. So those are a mixture of things that are reported, done internally. Some of them, the newer ones, will be aligned with version 2. The older ones we tend to uplift where we know that there's uncertainties or things that might have been done differently. And then we've got external consultants reports where we do verification. And again, we uplift it if we don't think it's accurate. And so, that's kind of the big thing. If we don't have numbers for projects, which is actually becoming very unusual now, and I think hopefully the last year's completed projects will be the last completed projects that we don't have it for. We use conservative benchmarks. So that means that we're not likely to internally make any claims about them. People know that those aren't real numbers, but it makes us look bad, and so it's an incentive to try and do something about that. And then we count sequestration separately, obviously, because it's upfront carbon. But interestingly, we're also starting to report rapidly renewed sequestration, so things like straw and hemp separately. We've got one project which is completed this year, which has a not inconsiderable amount of that, and we've got a couple on the drawing board now as we move towards sort of more regenerative principles. And then lastly, what we're going to probably do in the next reporting cycle is to add those net zero carbon building standard limits, because they're obviously all different for different types of reuse or new build, whether or not it's a different typology, if it's a mixed use building, when it was started on site. So hopefully that will start to give an indication of whether or not these numbers are actually good or not. And that again will sort of push us to do better, and we'll loop back round again to influence the stuff that Harry was talking about. So just to wrap up, I think hopefully we've covered like our workflow of why we, so how we respond to this challenge of reducing emissions, improving reporting quality, whilst doing it without really very much resource or time. And that's primarily, around sort of benchmarks, low friction touch points, the standard assemblies, moving into detailed measurement that allows lots of QA without people having to completely redo the assessment, and then sort of using reporting to sort of make that transparent, but also push us to keep doing it again.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you, Harry and Ben. That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'd say sort of more recently have we seen companies actually really delve into the weeds of how you implement this sort of thing, and that was an absolutely perfect example of how you can take LCA and really fix it into your workflow. So, thank you. That was really good. And so for the audience, you've heard about how One-Click LCA is supporting the work that Bennetts are doing. And now I'm going to show you a very, very quick demonstration of kind of, well, firstly, for those of you who are new to the software, what inputting the data actually looks like, and then for those of you who have used it before, we've recently had an update to the user interface, so I'm going to show you what that looks like, but then also focusing on the construction side of things, so you can see what actually the process is like for creating constructions, as Bennetts Associates have shown us. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Just bear with me. I believe it's that one. Okay, let me just check. Perfect. Yeah. So so this is of course the standard user interface for a project, and so within a project I've got my 4 different designs with a number of different calculation tools. But what I'll do is I'll come on to the RIX version 1 tool, and this is what it looks like, or this is how the user interface for inputting the actual data. And so this is, like I said, the updated interface for doing this. So on the left-hand side, you can see all the various different data input tabs. So you've got building materials, construction, site operations, energy consumption, and so on. So it's really just a process of working through these. We're currently on the building materials tab. So this is really where a lot of the action is going to happen. I have a list of all the different data points or materials that I've input into my building here. And so a couple of the new, or to start off with, it specifies which building part where the material is involved in. You've got the resource name. And so, of course, we've also got the green question mark, which brings up the data card showing environmental profile, things like that. So what the global warming potential is, performance ranking, and so on. All of the other fields for relevant for, so we've got the comment section as well, which is what Harry was explaining they utilize to create or to apply their own unique identifier. You've got service life, end of life processes, and things like that. So all of them can be adjusted, but they are, of course, input by default assumptions. So just a couple of small things is you can now kind of reorganize the columns to however you want. So if you're trying to look into a specific piece of information, you can kind of organize them all together nicely to be able to view them. You can specify which columns you actually show. So if you don't really want to see all of them, then you can just uncheck them and it will show what's relevant. And also you can search all the data that you've input already using the filter function. So maybe by building part, quantity, and so on. If I click the drop down though here, you can delve into the specific building elements. So let's say I'll go floors and horizontal elements. And so here, if I want to add a resource, you just click the big button that says add resource. You can search through, so I'm going to search through constructions. So it was mentioned that OneClick has a very big library of constructions, and so I think there's thousands of them, and so these are predefined. So maybe I want to find some UK based. In fact, I'll just search it here and check that, and now we can see lots of different material buildups that are specific. So specific to the UK. So if I wanted to add one, I just click there, add resource. But you can also now add multiple resources at the same time. So if I come back, we can see we've got a couple of constructions here, and we know this because of the small arrow. So if I click on this, you can see all the materials that actually make it up. And so this is one of the preset ones from OneClick, but also you can create and save your own. So if, for example, I wanted to add these 3 materials together, I just click the boxes here, click create construction, and we give it a name. So I'll call it, I'll say today's date, test 1. You can add a description, you can add a comment. So this is telling us when it was created. You can specify what part of the building it's for. So I'll say floor slabs. You can also save it to your company account. So if you can create and save constructions to the account, which means you can use them across all projects. So if there are consistent details that you use, just like in Bennetts Associates case, you can very easily access them again and again and again. We can see the list of materials here. We specify the quantity and the unit for our reference. So this is obviously completely unrealistic because I've got 25 meters cubed of hollow core concrete slab for 1 square meter of my test material, but you would define that to however much of each of these materials are within 1 meter squared of this. And then once I click save, where did it go? There it is. And we can now see it there. We've got our material, and when I input the quantity, all of the materials within it are going to proportionally update. So that's really it for what the new user interface looks like and how the constructions work. I will now jump back. I'll stop sharing and come back to the live storm and move on to the next section. So before we jump into our Q&A, I'm going to ask that if you are interested in hearing more about One-Click LCA, or how One-Click LCA can help you decarbonize your projects, you can let us know in the poll that's popping up on your screen now. And if you answer yes, we'll be in touch very shortly to set up some time to have a chat. So I'll leave that there for a second. I'm going to click not right now because I don't need to. And brings us on to the Q&A. Right, so we've got a couple of questions. Well, if anyone has any questions now, please go ahead. So I can see there was one from Lorenzo. And so this is Harry and Ben for you guys. What advice do you have for smaller practices that are only now wanting to put in place the processes to track embodied carbon during early stages? What would be the simplest steps to take for these practices which do not have dedicated staff to quickly build a library? That's a really great question.
Ben, do you want to?
I can have a go, and then you can tell me if you disagree. I think, especially for small practices that don't have very much resource, I think it's that thing at the beginning of just trying to not imagine what a perfect system would look like and just try to implement that somehow, because that won't work. Try to understand what your actual processes are. Look at stuff like the Letty embodied carbon primer, which will explain kind of where hotspots might be, and try and focus on those and maybe try and assess a couple of elements. If you've got kind of things that you do a lot of that you think are quite heavy in terms of embodied carbon, do an assessment for that and then consider whether or not you can reduce that and maybe build up kind of a few elements on that level. And then I think something that we've done relatively successfully is kind of almost tried to do bits and pieces of the assessment rather than sort of the full way through. So we've kind of done, when we started out this, we started on the elements, and we've also kind of trialed kind of assessments based on site materials and talking to contractors and stuff. And each project might not have kind of a full all the way through perfect situation, but you can kind of pick the projects where you think the opportunities are best for you to trial kind of ways of doing things, and then do that. But I think, yeah, my advice is just don't try to run before you're walking.
Yeah, I think you covered it, Ben. Yeah, the hotspots thing just been really, really important. Put the energy where you think there's going to be the most benefit. Because, for example, there's always the temptation for to focus on, for example, floor finishes. And if we're talking about carbon impact, the reality is, although it's a kind of easy one to look at in isolation, the bigger sort of hotspots are probably going to be structure or facade or something, depending on the project type. The other thing, I guess, would be something that Bennetts, I know for those early assessments you talked about, Ben, was partnering with sort of a small consultancy who can help do the formal assessment. So as much as you can spend time doing those kind of little the sort of hotspots or kind of spend time on element studies where you have time, equally trying to persuade clients to look at or consider embodied carbon in their process, and maybe appoint somebody to look at it on a small scale, because they're not crazy costs when you're generally when you're talking about a small building. It's a really good thing, and that's something we have sort of implemented now, trying to basically push it as on every project that there has to be some level of carbon assessment, whether that's us or somebody else. I guess the last thing is maybe about when you're kind of, like Ben said, maybe not running before you can walk, but at a certain stage, having the confidence to basically put fee in there for you to do the work, because it takes time. Architects shouldn't be doing everything for free. It's part of your work. If it's part of your design process, then charge somebody for it. And then you have the resource embedded in the project potentially, which is, I know, what a lot of people will eventually. You get to a point where you kind of can do that.
That's great. Okay, so we've got another one from Nathan. So for lifecycle assessments, in particular replacements and in-use energy, to ensure correct decisions are being made, we have found using current grid emissions and FES data sets, FES data sets over a 60 to 100 year period isn't always that accurate. Emissions related to the energy are reported the same every year rather than dropping year on year. So it's difficult to find tipping points. They're aware that some standards advise to use these methods, but do you use your own data sets outside of OneClick to review this?
Short answer, no. On the operational energy, we don't use. I guess, Ben, you from the kind of practice operation side, you do a lot of detail in terms of looking at sort of live carbon factors and things, don't you? But I think on LCA level, probably.
Yeah, certainly for LCAs we don't, but we've made, I think probably the closest we've done to something like that is when you do kind of new build versus retrofit versus, kind of keep what it is assessments. We tend to do that outside of kind of traditional LCA methods because, as you said, this is probably, I mean, you've said it, so hopefully it's not too controversial, but the assessments assumptions that you have to use for whole life carbon assessments are very rarely what's actually going to happen in real life. So you kind of, if we're reporting whole life carbon, we're doing it in accordance with the rules, but decisions might be made on a different basis. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we've got time for a few more questions. And so there's some that were from people who had to drop off the call, but here's one. So when you were reviewing other consultants' reports for your portfolio reporting, is there anything you wish they did differently?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it goes back to the transparency thing, but I think providing a clear breakdown of the data to a sort of, not just to kind of 5 categories, but to sort of RICS breakdown level is critical, and like everyone should be doing it. And it's kind of difficult because there's not really strict reporting formats or like guidance to follow, but yeah, showing that breakdown really helps people, because without that you can't interrogate anything. You can't really interrogate it, but B, also to the likes of practices wanting to use that data to inform future projects and savings and whatever. You can't also use it for that. You just have one number or 3 numbers that you can't really do much with. So breakdown and data transparency would be my comment.
Yeah, I think either it's just because it's more work or because it's considered to be proprietary information, but people tend not to provide very much granularity, and especially not the assumptions or the factors that go into sort of specific bits and pieces. And that's maddening. And we've taken, when we started to set up our own reporting, we almost sat down with all of the reports from external consultants and we're like, well, we hate that, we're not going to do that, and we wish this one had this, so we're going to do this. And I think that's been quite successful. And I should say, the consultants we work with are lovely people that do very good, accurate reporting, but I think we've tried to improve on that.
It's also worth saying there is another UK GBC guidance that does, I've forgotten what the full name of it is, but it might be whole life carbon modelling and reporting or something like that, that sort of touches on this a bit, and is a good starting point as well for kind of transparency and good practice.
Okay, so we've got time for one more very, very quick question. I've got one here, which is, do you calculate the carbon footprint of every project yourself? And if so, are you paid an additional fee for any of this?
Do you want to go, Ben? Or,
you can go, it's fine.
It's probably, what, now like 50-50 maybe?
Yeah, well, it's probably like 30-30, like external consultant, us doing it for free,
Yeah.
and then us doing it as a paid consultancy.
Yeah, and I guess being a practice of a certain size, we can, to some degree, absorb the sort of time taken on the projects where the client won't pay for it. But generally, it's in our EMS, isn't it now, that basically to try and force is the wrong word, but strongly encourage a client to set a target and pay somebody, be it us or a consultant, to do that assessment through a project, because it's so critical now.
Yeah, I think basically internally we tell the associate directors when they're negotiating that we're going to do this. So if you don't get the fee, then it's coming off your project, but we are going to do it. It's worth saying that we don't do the same service. So if it's for free, we're basically just getting a number that we can trust that will be reported publicly. If it's a paid for consultancy, then we're doing kind of the workshops, the reporting, the fee schedules, sitting down with the contractors and talking about how they can reduce energy, that sort of thing. So it's a very different thing. But yeah, I think we prefer it when we get paid to do it.
Of course. Right, I think that now nicely brings us to the end. We don't really have much more time for any further questions, but there is one from Nathan and Mark in the chat. So Harry and Ben, if you want to maybe answer those while I run through the next section. Okay, so that wraps it up for today's webinar. Before we leave, I want to highlight another virtual event that we have coming up. So this is One Click LCA's Winter Sustainability Summit, taking place on December the 5th. You'll hear from companies like Arcadis, Gensler, Lang O'Rourke and more, covering a range of topics to do with sustainable materials and decarbonisation of the built environment. And so if you scan the QR code there, I believe that will take you through to the registration form. And that's it from us. So I hope you found the session useful, and please do keep in touch with our speakers if you want to continue the conversation. And thank you once again, Harry and Ben. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And that was honestly a really great presentation of your work. So great stuff.
Thanks for having us, Sam.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.